Chapter 9. Pippi Goes to a Coffee Party. Tommy's and Annika's mother had invited a few ladies to a coffee party, and as she had done plenty of baking, she thought Tommy and Annika might invite Pippi over at the same time. The children would entertain each other and give no trouble to anyone. Tommy and Annika were overjoyed when their mother told them and immediately dashed over to Pippi's to invite her. Pippi was in the garden watering her flowers, still in bloom, with an old rusty watering can. As it was raining cats and dogs that day, Tommy told Pippi her watering seemed hardly necessary. "Yes, that's what you say," said Pippi, "but I've lain awake all night thinking what fun it was going to be to get up and water, and I'm not going to let a little rain stand in my way." Now Annika came forth with the delightful news of a coffee party. "A coffee party, me?" cried Pippi. She was so excited that she began to water Tommy instead of the rose bush, and she intended to sprinkle. "Oh, what will happen? Oh, I'm so nervous. What if I can't behave myself?" "Of course you can," said Annika. "Don't you be too certain about that," said Pippi. "You can be sure I'll try, but I have noticed several times that people don't think I know how to behave, even when I'm trying as hard as I can. At sea, we were never so fussy about things like that. But I promise that I'll take special pains today so that you will not be ashamed of me." "Good," said Tommy, and he and Annika hurried home again in the rain. "This afternoon at 3 o'clock, don't forget," cried Annika, peeping out from under the umbrella. At 3 o'clock, a very stylish young lady walked up to the steps of Settergren's house. It was Pippi Longstocking for a special occasion. She had braided her pigtails, and her red hair hung like a lion's mane around her. With red crayons, she had painted her mouth fiery red, and she had blackened her eyebrows so that she looked almost dangerous. With a crayon, she had also painted her fingernails, and she had put on greenhouse rosettes on her feet. "I should imagine I'll be the most stylish person at this whole party," she said contentedly to herself as she rang the doorbell. In the Settergrens' living room sat 3 fine ladies, with them Tommy and Annika and their mother. A wonderful coffee table had been spread, and in the fireplace a fire was burning brightly. The ladies were talking quietly with one another, and Tommy and Annika were sitting on the sofa looking at an album. Everything was so peaceful. Suddenly the peace was shattered. "Attention!" A piercing cry came from the hall, and the next minute, Pippi Longstocking stood in the doorway. She had cried out so loudly and so unexpected that the ladies had jumped in their seats. "Forward, march!" came to my next command, and Pippi, with measured steps, walked up to Mrs. Settergren. And there's the picture. "Halt!" she stopped. "Forward, arms forward, 1, 2, she cried, and with both hands gripped one of Mrs. Settergren's and shook it heartily. "Knees bent," she shrieked, and curtsied prettily. Then she smiled at Mrs. Settergren and said in her ordinary voice, "You see, I am really very shy, so if I didn't give myself so many commands, I'd just stand in the hallway and not dare come in." Then she rushed up to the other ladies and kissed them on the cheek. "Charming, charming, upon my honor," said she, for she had once heard a stylish gentleman say to a lady. Then she sat in the best chair she could find. Mrs. Settergren had intended the children to have their party up in Tommy and Annika's room, but Pippi stayed calmly in the chair, slapped herself on the knee, and said, looking at the coffee table, "There certainly looks good. Where do we begin?" At that moment, Ella, the maid, came in and with a coffee pot, and Mrs. Settergren said, "Please come and have some coffee." "First," cried Pippi, and was up on the table in 2 skips. She heaped as many cakes as she could onto her plate, threw 5 lumps of sugar in her coffee cup, emptied half the cream pitcher into her cup, and was on the back of the chair with her lute even before the ladies had reached the table. Pippi stretched her legs out in front of her and placed the plate of cakes between her toes. Then she merrily dunked the cakes in her coffee and stuffed so many in her mouth at once that she couldn't have uttered a word no matter how hard she tried. In the twinkling of an eye, she had finished all the cakes on the plate. She got up, struck the plate as if it was a tambourine, and went up to the table to see if there was any cakes left. The ladies looked disapprovingly at her, but that didn't bother her. Chatting gaily, she walked around the table, snatching a cake here and a cake there. "It certainly was nice of you to invite me," she said. "I've never been to a coffee party before." On the table stood a large cream pie, decorated in the center with a piece of red candy. Pippi stood with her hands behind her back and looked at it. Suddenly, she bent down and snatched the candy with her teeth. She then dived down a little, too hastily, and when she came up again, her whole face was covered in whipped cream. "Goody!" laughed Pippi. "Now we can play blindsman buff, but we've certainly got a blind man all made to order. I can't see a thing." She stuck out her tongue and licked away the cream. "This was indeed a dreadful accident," she said, and the pie is all ruined now anyway, so I may as well eat it all up at once." She dug into it with the pie server, and in a few minutes the whole pie disappeared. Pippi patted her stomach contentedly. Mrs. Settergreen had gone out into the kitchen, so she knew nothing of the accident to the cream pie, but the other ladies looked very sternly at Pippi. No doubt they would have liked a little pie too. Pippi noticed that they looked disappointed and decided to cheer them up. "Now you mustn't feel bad about such a little accident," she said comfortably. "The main thing is that we all have our health, and at a coffee party you should have fun." She then picked up a sugar bowl and tipped all the lumps of sugar onto the floor. "Well, my goodness," she cried, "now look what I've done. How can I make such a mistake? I thought this was granulated sugar. Bad luck seems to follow me today." Thereupon, she took a sugar spoon out of the other bowl and began to sprinkle granulated sugar all over the floor. "I hope you notice," she said, "that this is the kind of sugar you sprinkle on things. So it's perfectly all right for me to do this, because why should there be any kind of sugar sprinkle on things if somebody doesn't go and sprinkle it? That's what I'd like to know. Have you ever noticed what fun it is to walk on the floor that has sugar sprinkled all over it?" she asked the ladies. "Of course, it's even more fun when you're barefoot," she added, as she pulled off her shoes and stockings. "You ought to try it too, because nothing's more fun, believe me." At that moment, Mrs. Settergren came in, and she saw the sugar all over the floor and took Pippi firmly by the arm and led her over to the sofa to Tommy and Annika. Then she went over to the ladies and invited them to have more coffee. That the cream pie was disappeared, that only made her happy, because she thought the ladies had liked it so much that they had eaten it all. Pippi, Tommy, and Annika sat talking quietly on the sofa. The fire crackled on the hearth. The ladies drank their coffee, and all was quiet and peaceful again. And as so often happens at coffee parties, the ladies began to talk about their servant problems. Apparently, they had not been able to get very good servants, for they were not all satisfied with them, and they all agreed that it was better not to have any servants at all. It was much more satisfactory to do things yourself, because then you'd at least know things were getting done right. Pippi sat on the sofa listening, and after the ladies had been done talking, she said, "Once my grandmother had a servant named Malin. She had chilblains on her feet, but otherwise there was nothing wrong with her. The only annoying thing was that as soon as the company came, she would rush at them and bite their legs and bark. Oh, and then she would bark. You could hear it all through the neighborhood, and it was only because she was playful. Only, of course, strangers didn't always understand that. The dean's wife, an elderly lady, came to see my grandmother once, soon after Malin first came, and when Malin came dashing at her and bit her in the ankle, the dean's wife screamed so loudly that it scared Malin, so that her teeth clamped together and she couldn't get them apart. There she sat, stuck in the dean's wife's ankle until Friday, and the grandmother had to peel the potatoes herself. But at least it was well done. She peeled so well that when she was done, there were no potatoes left, only peelings. But after that Friday, the dean's wife never came to call my grandmother again. She never could take a joke. The poor Malin, who was always so good-natured and happy, though for that matter she was a little touchy at times. There's no denying that once my grandmother poked a fork in her ear, she howled all day. Pippi looked around and smiled pleasantly. "Yes, that was Malin for you," she said, and twiddled her thumbs. The ladies acted as if they had heard nothing. They continued talking. "If my Rosa were only clean," she said Mrs. Peregrine, "then maybe I could keep her. But she's a regular pig." "Say, you've ought to have seen Malin," Pippi interrupted. "Malin was so outrageously dirty that it was a joy to see her. Grandmother said for the longest time Grandmother thought that she had a very dark complexion, but honest and true, it was nothing but dirt that could be washed off. And once at the bazaar at the City Hotel, she got first prize for the dirt under her nails." "Mercy me, how dirty that girl was," said Pippi happily. Mrs. Settergreen looked at her sternly. "Can you imagine?" said Mrs. Granberg. "The other evening, when Britta was going out, she borrowed my blue satin dress without even asking for it. Isn't that dreadful?" "Yes, indeed," said Pippi. "She certainly seems to be cut from the same piece of cloth as Malin, from what you say. Grandmother had a pink undershirt that she was specially fond of, but the worst of it was Malin liked it too. Every morning Grandmother and Malin argued about who was to wear the undershirt. At least they decided it would be fair to turn it into each other take turns with it every other day. But imagine how tricky Malin could be. Sometimes she'd come running in when it wasn't her turn and say, 'No mashed turnip today if I can't wear that pink woolen undershirt.' Well, what is my grandmother to do? Mashed turnip was her favorite dish. There was nothing to do for it but give Malin the shirt. As soon as Malin got the shirt, she went out into the kitchen, as nice as could be, and began to mash turnips so that it would splatter all over the walls. There was silence for a little while. Then Mrs. Alexanderson said, "I'm not absolutely certain that I strongly suspect that my Hulinda steals. In fact, I've noticed that things disappear." "Malin," began Pippi, said Mrs. Settergreen, interrupted her. "Children," she said decidedly, "go up to the nursery immediately." "Yes, but I was only going to tell that Malin stole too," said Pippi. "Like a raven. Everything that she lay her hands on, she used to get up in the middle of the night and steal. Otherwise, she couldn't sleep well," she said. "Once she stole Grandmother's piano and tucked it into her own bureau drawer. She was so very clever with her hands," Grandmother said. Tommy and Annika took hold of Pippi and pulled her out of the room and up the stairs, and the ladies began a third cup of coffee. And Mrs. Settergreen said, "It's not that I want to complain about my Ella, but she does break the china." And a red head appeared over the stair rail. "Speaking of Malin," said Pippi, "maybe you are wondering if she used to break any china. Well, she did. She set apart one day a week just to break china. It was Thursday," Grandmother said, "and early 5 o'clock on Thursday morning you could hear the jewel of the maid in the kitchen breaking china. She began with the coffee cups and the glasses and the little things like that, and then went up to soup bowls and dinner plates. She finished up the platters and soup. There was such a crash bang in the kitchen all morning that it was a joy to hear," Grandmother said. "And if Malin had any spares time left in the afternoon, she would go into the drawing room with a little hammer and knock down an antique East Indian plates that were hanging on the wall. Grandmother bought new china every Wednesday," said Pippi, and disappeared up into the stairs as quickly as a jack-in-the-box. But now Mrs. Settergreen's patience had come to an end. She ran up the stairs into the nursery and up to Pippi, who had begun to teach Tommy to stand on his head. "You must never come here again," said Mrs. Settergreen. "If you can't behave any better than this." Pippi looked at her in astonishment, and her eyes slowly filled with tears. "That's just what I was afraid of," she said, "that I couldn't behave properly. It's no use to try. I'll never learn. I should have stayed on the ocean." She curtsied to Mrs. Settergreen and said goodbye to Tommy and Annika, and went slowly down the stairs. The ladies were now getting ready to go home. Pippi sat down in the hall near the shelf where rubbers were kept and watched the ladies putting on their hats and coats. "Too bad you don't like your maids," she said. You should have one like Malin. Grandmother always said that there was nobody like her. Imagine. One Christmas when Malin was going to serve a little roast pig, do you know what she did? She had read in the cookbook that the roast pig must be served with frilled paper in its ears and an apple in its mouth. But poor Malin didn't understand that it was the pig who was supposed to have the apple. You should have seen her when she came in on Christmas Eve with her best apron on and the biggest Gravestine apple in her mouth. "Oh, Malin, you're crazy," Grandmother said to her. And Malin couldn't say a word in her defense. She could only wiggle her ears until the frilling paper rustled, and to be sure she tried to say something, but it just sounded like blub, blub, blub. And of course she couldn't bite people in the leg as she usually did, and it wouldn't be a day when there was a lot of company. Poor little Malin. It wasn't a very happy Christmas Eve for her, said Pippi. The ladies were now dressed and said at last goodbye to Mrs. Sedegren, and Pippi ran up to her and whispered, "Forgive me because I haven't behaved myself. Goodbye." Then she put on her large hat and followed the ladies. Outside the gate, they parted ways. Pippi went toward Villa Canula and the ladies in the other direction. When they had gone a little ways, they heard someone panting behind them. It was Pippi, who had come racing back. "You can imagine my grandmother's mourned when she lost Malin. Just think, one Tuesday morning when Malin had time to break only about a dozen teacups, she ran away and went to the sea. My grandmother had to break the china herself that day, and she wasn't used to it, poor thing. She got blisters all over her hands. She never saw Malin again, and that was a shame because she was an excellent maid," Grandmother said. Pippi left the ladies and hurried on, but when they had gone a couple 100 feet, they heard Pippi far off, yelling at the top of her lungs, "See, never swept under the bed."